Thanks so much for being here. Thank you to the PhD admissions office, to Hillary especially for organizing this, and Lauren as well, and Devin. Thank you for the judges for being here, and thank you so much for all my PhD students for being here supporting me. My name is Hong Yi. I'm a PhD student at the Information Technologies Group, and today I'll be talking about the impact of AI on entrepreneurship. It's a great follow-up to Chuck's talk earlier, and would love to hear the debate afterwards on the results. So we've all heard about the potential job impact of AI, but there's also another side of the coin, or perhaps related issue, which is the potential lowering of the barriers of entry for entrepreneurship. And this is a famous quote from Sam Altman that he's very excited for the one-person unicorn, the one-person billion-dollar startup that will arise out of this disruptive period. And there's even a leaderboard out there called the Lean Startup Leaderboard, where they try to basically document the most profitable companies based on revenue per employee. So you can see here we have Midjourney and you have Anysphere, which is the cursor company, and they have basically 40 to 20 employees. This was probably like a couple of years ago, so still early in the trend. But they were still already generating $100 million with 20 employees at Cursor, which is a wild statistic, I think. Of course, that also is a very cost-heavy revenue, so there's a question about the quality of revenue, but that is a very large number for only 20 employees, right? And that's the idea of potentially we'll see 5 or 10 person companies creating billion-dollar unicorns. So my research question hypothesis is that if the arrival of ChatGPT was a cost-reducing shock to the ecosystem, then we would expect startups to adopt and adapt to this cost shock by perhaps lowering or recomposing their workforce. Perhaps they hire for more seniors, or perhaps they hire for more leveraged technical workers, right? And we approach this topic from 3 different angles. One is from the traditional sort of seniority exposure that we've seen from other papers like Eric Bjornsson's paper, Canaries in the Coal Mine, as well as Lichtinger and Hosseini. Another type is going to be role type, which is essentially given to us by Revelio, another data set that Chuck mentioned earlier, where we get to see the types of workers that these startups have, and we break down the impact of AI on these workers. And finally, we present a new sort of exposure measure, which is the AI product exposure. So here, instead of focusing on task description, we're going to focus on the company itself, right? So some companies are going to be more exposed to the AI hype train, you could say, than others. So that would help us sort of control for whether or not your growth is due to the AI hype train or not, and maybe your decision to hire fire workers could be related to how actively you adopt AI in your products. So a quick summary of the literature review. We already seen a little bit from Chuck about the employment impacts of AI. I think of this literature as being 2 ways. The first way being the productivity studies that are sort of from Bjornsson and Alex, and also Danielle Lee from our esteemed colleague here at MIT, and Lindsay Raymond as well, I guess, all of them previously at MIT at some point, showing the impact of AI on call center workers. We also see it from Nguyen Zhang, also MIT students, on the impact of writing, and the impact of consultants can be seen through Delacroix et al. So these are all productivity studies, micro estimates at a firm level, at an individual level of how AI has improved productivity, and they generally show that also it levels the playing field, right? That the sort of lower skilled workers are catching up with the help of AI. And then I think the second wave of studies are coming now, basically this year and last year, is sort of using more big data, administrative data, macro data, you could say, from BLS, from ADP, and that's coming from Hosseini and Lichtinger and Bjornsson et al., where they basically document this phenomenon of junior workers getting impacted by AI a lot more negatively and sharply than their sort of senior respective co-workers, right? And I would say there's a lot of debate on this because we also have the paper from Home Loan Investigator from using Danish administrative data showing there really isn't a big effect, and it's pretty much no effects, at least in the Danish survey data, right? So there is still an active debate on this topic, and I think where we differentiate ourselves from these papers is that we're sort of focusing a lot narrower on startups as opposed to the entire, which is the economy, which is basically dominated by S&P 500 companies, right? So the impact of that will be different from ours. We also are trying to maybe speak to or maybe extend the beachhead on the impact of AI on entrepreneurship. There's been relatively fewer papers on this. I would say the most significant comes to mind is the Otis et al. Paper, where they sort of give Canadian entrepreneurs access to Gen AI tools, and they see that like the more skilled workers or the more skilled entrepreneurs are actually the ones able to take advantage of Gen AI more so than the lower skilled entrepreneurs. So this is actually one of the few cases where it actually exacerbates inequalities as opposed to reduces it, right? And Ewins et al. Is a paper that I think we speak to in the form of like a parallel cost shock. Basically, Ewins et al., they talk about how the introduction of AWS in Silicon Valley lowered the cost of experimentation, and that led to VCs adopting a new strategy on how to invest in companies. They call it pray and spray, where they sort of invest smaller amounts in earlier startups, and then hopefully one of those will make it big and become a unicorn. And now that's enabled by like AWS. So that's a little bit different now because we're focusing more on the sort of the founders and their decisions to hire, and they're sort of focused more on like VCs and their decisions to invest. But I think it's related because they're both cost shocks to the ecosystem. And I think we will probably want to also explore this like VC strategy impacts later on. And then I would say the one that we're most closely related to here is the paper by Frank et al., right? So this is Morgan Frank and Sarah Bana and a few other colleagues at Pitt. Essentially, this is a very recent paper where they show is that a lot of the estimates that we see in the previous sort of studies from Lichtinger and Hottinger and also from Brios et al. Is that there potentially is a very big macro co-founder out there, but they're not able to sort of control for. And in this paper, what they show is that they use unemployment data to see that a lot of the unemployment pickups in these AI-exposed jobs already started rising, 2, 3, 4 quarters before the introduction of ChatGPT in the fall of 2022, right? So I think that is like pretty interesting evidence that maybe this is all explainable by the macro effects, the macro co-founders, and perhaps that we shouldn't be treating ChatGPT as like a natural experiment per se, right? And I think this is the sort of like the big caveat towards the end of the paper that I'll give. So this is the chart here that they have, which I thought was very stark. Basically, this is like unemployment levels, right? And you can see them all rising because of COVID in 2020, and then dropping. This is the risk of unemployment, So the risk of unemployment rises sharply due to the fact that there was a lot of over-hiring in the sort of immediate post-COVID period, and then when the Fed started hiking rates in 2022, then due to the increasing risk of inflation, then companies started to pare back on their sort of overhiring, and that's why you see this like sharp increase in the rise of unemployment. And the exposure to that is, I guess, the color here, where the sort of like darker color shows higher exposure to AI, and you can see that there's very little sort of distinguishing sort of effects across these different categories before ChatGPT's arrival. So within my context, I'm going to talk about VC-funded firms. So let me give a quick primer on what exactly VCs do and what are the different funding rounds. So VC companies depend on reaching specific funding milestones in order to scale their companies, right? So like if you're a two-person founder company that just went through YC, you might just get around 125K to 500K, depending on which year you got the YC cohort. And that is your starting money to sort of go out there and hire people and get your product out there into the market. Later on, you will get a seed round and a Series A round. These are considered early stage rounds of around 5 million for seed on average. And then for Series A, it would be around 10 million. So these are all designed for you to go out there, get your product out there in the world, whether it's like advertising spend, recruiting the engineering talent, getting the finance ready so that you can actually have financial statements to show investors to get to the next round, right? So these are all small things that you need to scale up as an early stage founder. And without that money, you're basically not able to scale your company. Like the point of that money when the VCs give it to you is for you to actually hire people and to grow as a company. So that's one of the key distinguishing features between our setting and like the S&P 500 companies is that we're able to use this funding shock as a way to say, if you're being given this money, you're supposed to deploy to hire people. So if you're not hiring as quickly, or if you're like, hiring the same amount, right, due to ChatGPT, then you can actually distinguish that between people who got the funding before ChatGPT versus those who got it after ChatGPT. And that's sort of the key distinction that we're trying to draw here. Of course, this treatment impact or the effect of funding on employment becomes a lot less stark and less slacker as you grow into a Series C, Series D, Series E company where it's more about liquidity as opposed to like having to grow. So another thing that's important with this type of treatment, which is the funding treatment, is that companies don't get to choose, at least vis-a-vis ChatGPT's arrival, when their funding round was raised. They get to choose it, maybe within like a span of 12 months, but without the knowledge of like ChatGPT being released, you had no idea that you were getting a funding round of Series A in like, let's say, June of 2022, as opposed to like June of 2023, right? So our attempt to come up with like a natural experiment here is that companies that were hiring and got a funding round to hire, 6 to 12 months before ChatGPT are going to be making different decisions from companies that got the funding 6 to 12 months after the release of ChatGPT. And this sort of like bandwidth of 24 months is the key to figuring out the estimates of our company, sort of the impact on employment. In terms of data sources, we use also Revelio data for the headcount. YC is very helpful because it is very public about its companies. It's got a list of all companies since 2005. So basically it's been almost 20 years now. And each batch is around 100 companies now. It used to be maybe like 30. And some of the most famous startups in the world came out of YC, right? You've got Airbnb, Instacart, Dropbox. So also my advisor, John Horton, has a YC company that was admitted last fall. This is after I started this project. So definitely no relationship in terms of like the paper and getting admitted. But yeah, that's another cool thing, cool little fact, I guess. And then also a lot of the sort of like the founders of YC are big VCs like Paul Graham, who like comment on entrepreneurship and give advice to sort of young founders. So I think YC has become like a historically important entrepreneurial hotspot for Silicon Valley. And it's therefore one of the reasons why I want to focus right now on YC companies. There's also a lot of them, like after 20 years, we'll have almost 5,000 YC companies, right? So it's a pretty good sample. And then these are going to be the most cutting edge companies because if you get funded at YC, you have a very strong signal to the rest of the ecosystem that you could get a Series A, a seed funding round. You definitely see higher rates of getting seed funding rounds and Series A companies out of YC. And that is definitely an important factor when it comes to like also adopting AI because YC has been very upfront about its. I don't show it here. I'll show it later on. Basically, very upfront about its like here is the startups we want, and now at this point, 80% of the requests for startup themes are AI related, right? So another reason why we think YC is a very good setting for us to study this. Our empirical context here, we're dealing with 2,400 companies from 2015 to 2025. We are going to use Series A as a funding event right now, but we also use seed funding later on, and then we sort of group them together for higher power. We're going to use a staggered diff and diff estimator, Summer and Abraham, but we're going to have to like loosen this estimator later on in order to get more power, and we're going to default back to the TuYe fixed effects estimator, just to give a bit more power and to show you our sort of like, I guess you could say it's like punchline effect at the end of the day with the co-founders. And then the control group here is going to be the YC companies that never receive a Series A, at least for the set of estimates that I'll be showing you. So these are basically companies that went through YC, came out, probably got a seed round, but didn't get a Series A. So you could say that there is some type of like selection bias, right? Because the market sniffs out the sort of losers in a certain market and therefore didn't give them a Series A. But what we're arguing is that at the end of the day, our core estimate or comparison point is actually between the pre and the post receiving Series A. So that's the key thing. We're just using the quote unquote never treated group as like a baseline of what you'd have done without receiving the Series A. But the key comparison here is like estimating the funding impact of receiving the funding before ChatGPT and estimating the funding impact after ChatGPT and then taking the diff, right? So that's basically what we show here. So the blue is the pre-2022 Q4 companies that received the Series A. And you can see, you receive a Series A and you keep growing relatively same pace. I mean, there's a little bit of acceleration here, but it's kind of hard to tell. There's a lot of, obviously, anticipation effect when it comes to funding rounds. You announce it probably like 6 months in advance of the actual money hitting your bank. So there's going to be a lot of like, oh, we should hire more now in order to prepare for this money coming into our bank, right? When it comes to the red line or the orange line here is the post ChatGPT companies that received the funding after ChatGPT was released. As you can see, a pretty stark difference here in terms of the employment growth. I'm showing this in logs. So everything is, you can sort of interpret later on in terms of percentages as an approximation. And this is on the left, on the right-hand side, basically just taking the differences between the blue and the orange and just plotting it out. So definitely quite stark in terms of the employment effects, at least based on this current setting. I'm going to go through it a bit more quickly. So basically, now I'm showing this in terms of like the breakdown by seniority, and I'm aggregating across all of these estimates, right? So instead of showing you, 8 different estimators, dynamic estimators, I'm just going to show you the ATT. As you can see, with the junior category, there's also a sharp drop vis-a-vis the seniors. And what's interesting is that executives are also seeing drops in their headcount growth. So it's almost like an inverted U, where the beneficiaries of this trend might be the sort of the senior ICs, right? The people who are experienced, but not quite managerial yet, because they can actually use these technologies to do more, given their experience. We also can break it down by the role type. So instead of showing you, the 10 or 100 different types of roles that you see in Revelio, I'm just going to categorize this by 3 different buckets. It's going to be the external commercial type, which is basically like sales and marketing. And then we have internal commercial, which is basically like finance groups, accounting groups, like internal IT. Actually, internal IT is going to be the last one. It's going to be engineering. Engineering is where, obviously the software engineers are, the data scientists are there as well. So these are the 3 big buckets. And what we see is that the most sort of like negative impact is going to be concentrated on engineering, the junior engineers, and then we see some impact as well on executives. So that is sort of like an interesting dichotomy, sort of heterogeneity across groups, because in the external commercial, we almost don't detect any sort of noticeable differences across the 3 seniority levels. And overall, we probably can't see any sort of like declines in external commercial versus engineering, where we actually do see some declines. So So we've also did one final thing, which is basically, this is a novel aspect of like the measurement of the exposure, which is essentially look at the descriptions of each company and trying to estimate to what extent you're exposed to AI. And this is like by taking the descriptions and then using an LM as a judge to give us a score between 0 and 100. And that allows us to, these are some of the themes in YC, and that allows us to sort of estimate the score. And you can see here, the red line is basically the most recent companies, and these are the ones sort of most exposed to the AI trends that you see, and therefore the ones with the highest scoring in the AI exposure. Okay, since we need to wrap up, I need to show you this plot again, because this is what the plot was saying, was that like it was happening before AI was starting to hit. And essentially what we did was that we had to do a placebo exercise where we varied the cutoff time for our different diff estimates, and we sort of like ran it again through all the different potential cutoffs. So what I'm showing you here is like, if I were to change a cutoff from 2022 Q4 to any of these other cutoffs, our estimates are going to actually co-move significantly with macro variables. Macro variables being, for example, interest rates, as well as the VC funding. Right? So you can see I'm using the same dashed lines here, which is the hike from FOMC and then the ChatGPT release date. And you can see, we can also see here that the worst of the sort of like hiring effects, if it were to be significant in this plot, of course, it was during the FOMC hiking period. And there was this huge decline that occurred as a result of interest rates being hiked up. So a lot of the estimates that we're seeing sort of from the literature, I guess, right now is using 2022 Q4 as a natural experiment. But I would say that this placebo impact or analysis is one big caveat to all of our estimates. Thank you.